The day he fired me, the office smelled of burnt coffee and victory he thought he had earned. His smile was polished, corporate, clean, practiced, the kind of smile that believes endings come cheap. I said nothing. I packed my files, left the building, and went home to write one letter. Not an apology, not a plea. Just a quiet record of truth sealed in an envelope. A week later, that letter detonated in silence, and the man who dismissed me discovered what real checkmate feels like. You do not notice the people who keep things from falling apart until the moment everything falls apart. That is the work I was hired to do, the quiet kind of labor that lives in margins and margins of margins, signatures witnessed, dates matched, clauses cross-referenced until the paper becomes a lock. My desk had the usual markers of that life, a row of tabbed binders, each label immaculate, a small brass plaque with my name and title, a mug that had once held coffee and now kept it stale and honest. The office around me hummed with the low, indifferent energy of a place that believed in momentum above all else. Camera moves in slowly on the plaque. The hum carries. My voice is steady. You do not notice me until something goes wrong, I say. The sentence lands like a fact. He arrived like every tempest labeled as possibility. Jason Hale was tall in a way that filled space before he did, a man who treated corridors like stages and whiteboards like altars. His first week was a montage of spectacle, a brisk stride down the hallway, a grin that showed too many teeth for someone who expected others to follow, a whiteboard lettered in thick marker velocity, greater than bureaucracy, big enough to swallow the room. He climbed on the break room table for a pep talk, arms out as if receiving applause, and people laughed because someone always laughs first. Cut to quick shots, Jason high-fiving a junior associate, Jason handing a binder to the receptionist with a smile, Jason drawing rocket doodles next to the weekly plan. The cuts are energetic, a contrast to the stillness that keeps me awake at night. He could charm the oxygen out of a room. He could also break things he did not understand. That was the variable. There was a fragment of something softer behind the swagger. One morning, before the office lights were fully on, I saw him in the parking lot outside, sitting alone in his car. The camera finds him through the windshield, his forehead in his palm, a bank letter on the passenger seat. For a breath, it was possible to imagine the noise as performance and not armor. He was accountable to someone, to something, beyond the brand slogans. In a second, his jaw set, and he was back to being the storm. That small human moment did not excuse the recklessness that followed. It only made what came next more complicated. We had a single narrow hinge that would decide millions of dollars and a boardroom full of reputations. It lived in a document labeled Exhibit C and in a clause numbered 11.4. Close up on the binder, the header stamped, the clause highlighted in red. On the screen the line reads, Exhibit C must be original, signed in ink and notarized in person prior to escrow release. No electronic substitutes. No exceptions. I can say the language aloud and still feel the metal in it. Visual overlay. A simple timeline slides across the frame. Pitch date. Escrow condition. Deadline. The stakes are clean. This is not law. It is law translated into process. Lorraine Price arrived at mid-morning, like someone who knew too much to be dramatic. She moved with the precision of decades in her hands. Her folder was leather and weighty. The brass edge of her notary seal caught the light when she set it down. Close up on her badge, state-issued number, small and authoritative. She sat in the corner of the pre-pitch walkthrough, pen poised, eyes steady. She was what you would call old school, which in our world is shorthand for reliable. The room was full of noise, chairs scraped. Bottled water was opened. Someone made introductions that sounded like confetti. Lorraine did not join the spectacle. She arranged her materials as if arranging a small ritual. That is how these things work. Someone attends the ritual, and the ritual grants the company its right to move. Jason barged in because storms cannot resist the center of rooms. The camera swings as he does. A door that slams, the room's volume rising with him. He did not move like someone apologetic for the space he took. He moved like someone who expected the space to bend. In doing so, he knocked Lorraine's purse from the chair beside her. A small ordinary thing. A leather strap flapped. A pen rolled, he laughed. He doodled on the whiteboard. He made a gesture that was not an apology. Lorraine watched him for a beat that was patient and then deliberate. She closed her folder with a single exact motion. She rose, collected her brass seal, and without a word she left. The camera holds on her back as she walks away. The hallway light frames her in a slow-motion corridor, as if the building itself had chosen to slow time so the exit could be seen for what it was. Eleanor's hand moves to her laptop. The log window appears on screen. An animated bubble pops with a timestamp. Lorraine Price left at 10:14 a.m. Notarization incomplete. A small lock icon blinks. The entry is encrypted, duplicated, and mirrored. There is no flourish. There is only recorded truth. My face does not change. I am careful about what my face gives away. I close the log and push it to 3 external backups. The camera moves back to the hallway where Lorraine's silhouette recedes and people in the room continue to talk about slides and color palettes, as if nothing of value had just left. On-screen text fades in as the screen cools. She left. The clock kept ticking. I learned early in this job that momentum and paperwork move at different speeds. Momentum demands voice, visible motion, applause. Paperwork demands patience, precision, and the stubbornness of metal. For a week, the office favored the first and punished the second. The whiteboards bloomed with rockets and mantras. Calendars emptied in one smooth swipe. People who once asked for approvals were suddenly confident in improvisation. The energy felt like a tide that wanted to redraw the shoreline to suit itself. A brief montage. Markers skitter across glass. Someone erases a compliance meeting from a shared calendar with a single decisive click. A junior associate prints 50 copies and does not notice the wrong logo at the top of the page. Those are small, ordinary failures until they are not. I watched 2 interns, Mia and Ethan, fold themselves around a printer and a stack of manila folders, their hands moving faster than comprehension. They believed in the ritual of assembly: clip, staple, tab. As if ritual could conjure law. It could not. I closed the drawer where Exhibit C sat. The paper fit the tray like a promise kept in reserve, original, unmarked, blank signature line waiting. I exported a copy to the off-site vault, watched the progress bar crawl and finish, watched the system stamp the file with a timestamp and an encrypted seal. I duplicated it twice more and sent the copies to 3 different secure locations. The on-screen overlays showed blue locks, mirrored drives, a small green check that meant that somewhere beyond our building the truth would remain, even if we lost the room. I did not shout. I did not chase anyone down the corridor. I logged. I did not scream. I did not beg. I documented, I said aloud once to the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the words were a small liturgy I had used for years. Documentation is not drama. Documentation is a ledger against amnesia. Days folded into each other in the way crisis does when nobody accepts responsibility. The interns improvised. They produced packets that looked whole from a distance. Closer, errors multiplied. A header from a previous version, an exhibit marked Exhibit C with a digital signature line, a bold font that read like marketing copy. At one point, I watched Ethan slide a single page unnumbered and unsigned into a binder, as if the act made it complete. I could have stopped him. I could have corrected the font, reprinted the sheet, explained the clause. For reasons I could not have explained then, I did not. Perhaps I believed the documents would not be needed. Perhaps I wanted to preserve the record of what was left undone. Perhaps I trusted process more than intervention. Jason moved through the days like a performance, and yet the performance now bore tiny, telling fissures. One night, past midnight, I left the office later than usual and found his parking space empty. The lot was nearly deserted, lights like distant galaxies. Through the dark glass of his car, his silhouette was large, his head bowed. I saw him through the windshield. A bank notice on the passenger seat, a photograph of a small boy taped to the dash. For a moment he was not the stage in a suit. He was a man with a weight I had not expected. He rubbed the bridge of his nose as if trying to steady blood in an anxious stream. He practiced his lines alone in the mirror the next morning. I saw him by chance in the executive lounge, mouthing the upbeat cadence of a pitch he believed would excuse the shortcuts. He did not look like a man who did not know how to keep a promise. He looked like a man who feared the cost of keeping one. That fear, I understood, could be as dangerous as arrogance. It explained, but it did not absolve. The days narrowed toward a single red mark on a calendar. I had put my flag in the soil and not moved. I kept the original Exhibit C where I always had, and I kept my logs where they could be found and verified. Meanwhile, the company moved forward. Meetings were cancelled. The legal review was scheduled as a later item. A new deck version with glossy spreads and aspirational bullets replaced the careful version I had assembled. People applauded creativity. They did not ask whether the contract clauses supported the story we told. Then the message arrived. It came not as a thunderclap, but as a surgical tap. An email subject line that read with cool precision. On screen for a beat, the words blinked like a light in a cathedral. Exhibit C confirmation required per clause 11.4. Close of business today. Claire Dawson. The clock in the corner of my screen brightened, as if someone had set a spotlight on it. The office noise dimmed. Time condensed. I opened the email and read the sentences that had no warmth, no politics, no negotiation, only the unambiguous need for proof. I did not hesitate. My fingers moved with the calm efficiency of ritual. I replied precise, factual. There was no flourish. Original notarized Exhibit C not on file. I hit send. The outgoing message carried an animated stamp and a timestamp. The mail server received it, and the record began to roll like a film negative. In my head, the day split into two tracks. The public track, where the company would meet and speak, and the private track, where the law sat like a patient observer, waiting for facts to meet consequence. The public track continued as if by habit. Jason rearranged a slide, joked with an associate, drew another rocket in the margins of the board deck. The private track had other ideas. A notification stung my screen. Pitch final, Monday 5 p.m. SOT's main boardroom. The calendar square pulsed as though it had a heartbeat. I could see the collector of events closing its jaws around us. I stood a moment and watched the drawer where Exhibit C rested. Its presence was at once a comfort and a danger. It was the fulcrum on which reputation and millions balanced. I walked to the window and watched people pass in the lobby below, unaware of the hinge tightening. The light there was ordinary and merciless. I closed my eyes briefly and felt the weight of what had been left undone by others and preserved by me. The log, the backups, the encrypted file, these were not triumphs. They were instruments in a slow, inevitable accounting. The screen dimmed for a moment and then brightened again. The words that would define the coming hours scrolled on a translucent band. Monday, 5 p.m., the room that decides everything. I felt the air shift, and for the first time in a long while, the office felt small and clear. Like a map reduced to a single, unavoidable route. I walked back to my desk, sat and opened the log window. The entries were a series of clean, unemotional facts. They might appear cold to someone who demanded spectacle. They would be searing to someone who understood the cost of absence. I saved the file, encrypted the backups again, and let the room continue its construction of a future that might already be missing its foundation. The weekend that followed was a slow, dry ache. Phones pulsed with drafts and pep talks. Phrases like momentum and synergy were repeated until they sounded like incantations. I kept to my pattern. I did not attend any of the makeshift weekend huddles. I read a novel in a cafe and let the public life of the company be someone else's weather report. The log would remain. The deadline would arrive. The rest, I told myself, was truth-meeting. The boardroom door closed with a soft precision that made every small sound inside seem larger. The room was long, minimal, and suddenly clinical. Ceiling lights had been dimmed to a careful neutrality that erased warmth. A digital clock above the conference screen became a metronome. Minute by minute, it counted toward an outcome that no slide could alter. Mark Whitman sat at the head of the table like a man waiting for a diagnosis. His hands were folded. His face was the calm of someone who had learned to do gravity with his shoulders. Renwick had come prepared. Claire Dawson sat near the center, with a slim leather binder, the kind of case lawyers use when they intend to let documents speak louder than argument. Her fingers were folded in that particular way that suggested a scalpel cloaked as courtesy. The investors behind her were quiet, professional, and practiced in the economy of implacable attention. They had flown in to watch a narrative become contract. They would leave if the narrative failed to become law. Jason entered with his practiced cadence. He stood, smiled, and opened with the cadence of marketing, ambition framed as inevitability. He moved through his lines as if he were distributing optimism. The camera of the mind that had watched him for weeks cut between his gestures and the blank face of the clock. For those first minutes, the room felt like the space before weather breaks, charged and expectant. I sat one seat from the edge with a pen that I did not use, fingers folded over a legal pad, to steady the small tremor that can visit even those who keep order for a living. My job was not to perform. My job was to produce evidence that could be relied upon when performance failed. The binder next to me sat as it had all week. Exhibit C rested in my mind the way a heartbeat rests in the body. It had to be present and intact. That is how estates are moved, how escrow releases are permitted to breathe. Claire began to flip pages with a motion that was calm enough to be cruel. She was scanning the binder, as if reading a ledger that had been laid out in front of her, the way an auditor might read a patient. She turned slowly and then her hand paused. The camera in my head moved with it and rested on the page where Exhibit C should have been notarized. The silence that followed was not theatrical. It was forensic. Where is the original notarized Exhibit C? Claire's voice was even. It carried no accusation. It carried an invitation for fact to present itself. It was, by tone, the most dangerous kind of question. For a moment, Jason counted on charm like a man counting on a bridge. He offered the rehearsed answer. It was in transit, he assured them, the kind of word chosen to suggest motion rather than absence. He smiled as if motion were a substitute for substance. The room waited for logistics to catch up. I saw a memory cut in his face then, Lorraine's silhouette in the corridor, the slow method by which she had closed her folder and left. For a flicker, the man who had been practicing cadence in a mirror seemed as small as a man holding a photo behind his chest. That smallness was not pity. It was a confirmation that he had misjudged which forces would decide the day. I rose. Walking to the center felt less like an entrance, and more like the last necessary movement in a calculation. My voice was measured. The room leaned in because lawyers and investors are trained to listen for syllables that carry documentation. I recited, precisely and without flourish, the notation that would not be undone by rhetoric. Notary departed on March 22nd at 9:43 a.m. Notarization was incomplete. Clause 11.4 is triggered. The words were simple. They were a mechanism. As I spoke, a small graphic appeared on the screen at the head of the table. A timestamp, an encrypted seal, and 3 mirrored backups lighting up in sequence visual confirmation that the record was not only claimed, but conserved. Claire closed the binder with an absent, clinical motion and looked at Mark. She said plainly, "Escrow release is void without the notarized original." The room held as if inhaling before a plunge. Jason's composure fractured in an instant that was more human than triumphant. He blinked, the practiced smile gone, and sank slowly into the nearest chair as if gravity had been briefed on his predicament. In his face, there was the sudden recognition of consequences that charisma could not soft focus. For a beat, it felt like an accident of fate, rather than a punishment. He had been betting on motion to substitute for proof. The bet had failed. Investors stood with the same economy of motion that had opened their attendance. Their shoes on tile made a sound that filled the room. No one raised their voice. No one slammed anything. They gathered their folders and their presents, and moved with a certainty that communicated finality. Claire packed her binder with the careful motions of a person who understands how to close a file, and who knows when the book is finished. Mark breathed once and then twice, the sound like measured negotiation with himself. He asked a question that sought a patch, a reprieve, a way to say the company would reschedule and thereby salvage hope. The question hung between procedure and will. Claire's answer was a legal hinge that needed no rhetoric. A contractual condition had not been met and could not be repaired with a promise. The decision was not moral judgment. It was the mechanical enforcement of agreed terms. The investors left. The echo of their departure was the story. The boardroom returned to a kind of quiet that held the residue of a struck bell. People looked at one another, as if trying to recall on what scaffolding they had been building. Jason sat with his head bowed in his hands for a few heartbeats longer than decorum allowed. He appeared diminished, not vicious. A human figure folded by the realization that boards and contracts are not swayed by the loudness of belief. Back at my desk, the aftermath arrived as a series of documents and short messages. There was no loud triumph. The CEO asked for a brief debrief, and HR undertook the work of a clean separation. The executive choreography that followed was methodical. They did not make a spectacle of removal. They made a list. A staff meeting would follow. A memo would be circulated. The necessary business adjustments were administered with the same unromantic hands that had once prepared the legal. Binders Claire sent a one-line message that landed in my inbox with the same clarity as a judge's signature. Thank you for the log. It was all the acknowledgement I would accept. I did not respond. Recognition is not the point of insistence on process. The promotion that came was not a fanfare. Mark offered me an expanded scope for pitch oversight and compliance with the kind of quiet that implied trust over emotion. He said the company needed a steady hand. I took the folder and set it on my desk. I accepted the responsibility because it was necessary and because I had already been carrying it without the title. The encrypted copies of Exhibit C remained in their secure vaults. I opened the drawer once and looked at the blank signature line and felt the small odd satisfaction that belongs to people who watch small truths outlast the noise that tries to bury them. The office would return to its rhythms now, perhaps chastened, perhaps momentarily respectful. I did not look for applause. I packed the pen away and closed the log. My voice broke the silence in a way that was not an announcement but a closure. I did not shout. I logged the truth. The camera pulls back to a frame that holds the drawer. The blank line and my face as the world outside the window continues, unaware that quiet rigor had just redirected the course of much that had been poised to fall. My boss fired me. I mailed one letter and checkmated him. They told me, in a dozen small and tidy ways, that I was dispensable. Meetings were reassigned. Invitations stopped arriving. My name continued to exist on org charts and email headers, but the work that gave me shape and purpose was being parceled out as if it were a commodity that could be redistributed without consequence. It is a particular kind of dismissal, quieter than a public firing but no less decisive. It is the removal of authority, the gentle erasure of competence, the way an organization can attempt to run a story without its vital fact-checker. I could have matched noise with noise. I could have shouted from the stairwell, rallied empathy, staged a scene dramatic enough to circulate in company chat and social feeds. Instead, I chose the opposite, a single, deliberate letter and the slow certainty of records. I mailed a physical copy of the log, properly annotated and sealed, to the one place that listens when performance claims collide with written obligation, the Investor Council. The letter was not a plea. It was an inventory of truth, a clear ledger of what had been done, what had been left undone, and when. It was evidence offered to those whose decisions were not swayed by charisma, but by contract. That small act altered everything. It was not vindictive. It was surgical. It removed the theater and left only consequence. In the silence that followed, change arrived with the economy of a legal decision. Hearings, reviews, personnel shifts. The man who believed momentum could substitute for proof discovered, with quiet astonishment, that momentum is a poor guarantor of millions. The company recalibrated. I was given responsibility I had long performed informally. I was not celebrated with banners, only entrusted with formal authority to prevent the next collapse. If there is a moral to this, it is not one of petty triumph. It is the abiding lesson that integrity is not loud. It is a practice measured in daily small acts, accurate timestamps, careful backups, a willingness to record what others would prefer to forget. In a world that rewards spectacle, the steady insistence on fact becomes a rare and powerful form of resistance. Courage is not always a speech. Sometimes it is a slow fidelity to truth. If this story echoes something you have seen in your own workplace, I invite you to share it below. Tell me about a time when quiet evidence mattered more than a louder voice. Your experience can help someone else recognize the value of records before a crisis arrives. If you found this story useful, consider subscribing. I will bring more true-to-life corporate narratives that examine how small acts of discipline change outcomes. Subscribe to follow the next chapter of people who guard the hinge between promise and practice. The office returns to its daily lights and its ordinary noise. Paper will be stacked again, and calendars will fill with optimistic verbs. I will continue the work I was hired to do, to make sure that when decisions are framed as facts, the facts will still be there. That is how one letter can checkmate a moment of recklessness, not by anger, but by accuracy.